I'm Jerome Meadows, founder and director of Indigo Sky Community Gallery here in Savannah, Georgia, and Meadowlark Studio. This is the final of 3 workshops that have been happening over the last 3 weekends, working with deep students, basically creating what I refer to as icon jars, 7-day candle jars that have been cleaned out and are empty. The idea is for the students to bring in objects that have a personal meaning for them, personal value, and obviously things that are small enough to fit in the jar or be attached to the jars. And to create what I'm calling visual poems. They started out by identifying maybe 3 or 4 of the objects that were of greater value to them and writing poetic lines in reference to that, so that their arrangement in the jar is far from arbitrary. But it was interesting because after the first day, I asked them to put all their objects in the jars for storage. And voila, they started seeing references and a sense of meaning just by placing these meaningful objects in the jars. But I wanted them to take it a step further and have a bit more compositional intentionality, so that in the final analysis you're looking at objects that some stand out because they're of greater value or importance, and then the interrelationship between various objects. Again, creating what one could look at as a visual poem.
So what do you mean by a visual poem?
The idea that when I think of a poem, I think of words put together more as an insinuation, more of a reference of something rather than a didactic explanation. And visual objects have the capacity to function as those words. Inferencing things and bringing symbolic potential to objects. The fact that they're choosing their objects selectively is, in my mind, similar to if you're sitting down to write a poem, what words do you select and how do those words come together? So I see them as opposed to, I do a lot of collage work, assemblages, which are larger versions of these jar pieces on a flat surface. And those typically have more of a narrative statement. In fact, last year, working with deep students, we did something more along those lines, where there is more of a descriptive, visually descriptive narrative. Whereas visual poem, by the confines of those jars, you're limited. One might think of it as the restrictions that one faces when you're working with a haiku, for example. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Myself when young.
Good question, and there's 2 approaches to that. One is having grown up in a neighborhood similar to this in New York City, where there was not a whole lot of art activity going on. I found it really of extreme value when I could connect with artists or organizations or experiences that showed me that art is a viable entity. And so I like being able to pass that on as a successful self-employed artist. I mean, everything that I do by way of my livelihood stems from my studio, and in some quarters that's impossible. There's a practical reality that says you cannot survive as an artist. So I like the fact that I'm a living example that you can, and what better way than to have students come into my studio. I mean, they're our future. And so what could be more important than to make sure that young people are, their creative geniuses are fueled. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the Deep Center is, from my understanding, is that students are taken from the context in which they exist. Not taken from, but looked at within that context. And instead of being very matter-of-fact about it, are challenged and inspired to be creative in their responses to that environment. I think all too often as we're addressing these sociological issues, politics and economics and demographics of different sorts are the buzzwords. It's far too infrequent that you hear culture as part of the mix. And as far as I'm concerned, that is a primary solution. It's not just doing workshops, it's doing workshops with students who have been interviewing community members and discovering what that community is about. So one of the word games we played in the beginning was I took these tag cards and I had each student write a poetic line about the east side of Savannah. And then we put them in a basket. They were picked out randomly by a different student who read that card and then wrote their response to it. And then we read them all together. It was like this spontaneous poem about what they had experienced in East Savannah. And then I had them do the same thing about their own personal life. Being able to do what I can to help foster the creative well-being of our future generations.